Antoine Mignon was a French entomologist. That's fancy talk for Antoine Mignon studied insects and spoke French. In 1934, he wrote a book about insect flight, and it started with a story about a bee. After applying the laws of math and flight to figure out how bees flew, Mignon said, "It's impossible." Not exactly a fairy tale ending, but it took off. For example, in 1997, Jill Barrett, the then CEO of Mattel, always wore a bumblebee pin to work. See, Barrett was one of just 2 female CEOs on the Fortune 500 list that year. To her, Mignon's bee story was a reminder to ignore what others called impossible. And the bee story also became a bee movie, where a bee and a human fall in love. That same bee then flies a plane and sues Ray Liotta. Yeah, I don't really know how Mignon would feel about that last one, but these stories underline the same idea. Just because you aren't supposed to fly doesn't mean you can't. So fly. Mignon's story is clearly an inspiration, but it's also incomplete. All right, look, I don't study bees. I am a graduate student in communication at the University of Southern California. I study how our words shape our world. In 1934, Mignon's words about a bee caused us to downplay the bee's role in the world. It's not just a symbol of inspiration. Moreover, this bee story matters to us as communicators because when we talk about other people who often speak the same language and are of a different race, ability, class, and so forth, those stories can also be incomplete. And that creates divisions between us in the world. So, to change the stories we tell about one another, we should change how we listen. Because listening is a doorway to understanding, and if we can understand someone, it'll expand how we connect with each other in empathetic ways, with new ideas and trust and love and literally all the good things that can make our world sting a little less. So listen up. I have exciting news. In 2001, researchers at Tsinghua University in China learned how bees fly. They used high-speed cameras and laser beams and a tiny little bumblebee, who lived, by the way, and they saw that bees create these micro whirlwinds with their wings and ride them. It should be noted that this flight pattern now helps us understand things like hovercraft. In other words, the next time your Uber driver flies you to your destination, thank a bumblebee. Moreover, what happened with Mignon in 1934 was this. His story was incomplete, and that damaged how we connect with one another in the world. See, because assuming lab equipment wasn't all that kept him from putting that story forth about the bees and hovercraft, he still could have asked around. Rhetorically speaking, Mignon's conclusion, "It's impossible," was definitive. And definitive conclusions, by their nature, stop us from asking questions. Had Mignon said something like, "It's impossible," right? Different voices could have joined the conversation and advanced flight science sooner. Similarly, when we tell stories about someone different from us, the difference between saying that person is dangerous and that person's dangerous, right, is that the second version invites new perspectives. But there's also something about our brain that reinforces this us and them mentality. Cornell University professor Judith Brownell calls it the thought-speech differential. In 1 minute, we are capable of speaking about 150 words, but our brains can process around 500 words in that same amount of time. So there's a gap. In a typical conversation, the gap is filled with thoughts like, "I'm hungry," or "Is my phone on silent?" However, when someone says something we think is a threat, that excess brain power builds a wall of separation between us and the other person while they're still talking. And what we perceive as a threat relates to what linguists call abstract words. And there are 2 things about abstract words. First, how we define them depends entirely on our unique experiences with them. And second, abstract words play a huge role in shaping the world we live in. Let's try something. Imagine how a soldier would describe the abstract word freedom. Now, imagine how a person who had been to jail would describe it. One word, two completely different definitions. They can mean both, and that's fine. It's when we fail to ask questions and build understanding between one another that idea sharing, empathy, and trust stops. In 1934, Magnon's story interacted with the bee because him and the bee came together because of a word, flight. And they had different experiences with that word. See, the story Magnon grew up with was that insects fly because their wings go up and down. But in 2001, the researchers saw that a bee's wings actually move back and forth, which changed the story. We can be like those researchers and change the stories we tell about other people if we tame that gap in our brain. Professor Brownell from earlier explains, if we repeat what someone says to us in our head while they say it, that excess brain power applies directly to the conversation, which helps us listen with more empathy and curiosity and tell stories that unite, not divide. Magnon's story in 1934 about a bee caused us to see the bee as a symbol of inspiration and nothing more. It wasn't until other researchers expanded our understanding of a bee that our world changed. But it shouldn't take a scientist to see that the stories we tell about people different from us, who even speak the same language, are incomplete. Now, I don't know the words that can tell the right story, but I know we can figure it out if we listen better, especially when it's hard. I got an older brother. Growing up, we called him B. And B is highly observant, whip smart, and ridiculously lazy. This often meant that his genius was used to make his life easy. One day he was working on this PowerPoint presentation for class, and he leaned back in his chair and he was like, man, I wish I can just like do this online with my friends. And I was like, what? And he was like, this presentation. My friends should help me do it online. And I just shrugged him off. Little did we know, about a year later, Google would come up with its own version of this idea. Google Drive. Ever heard of it? Yeah. B thought that up at 15. Well, kinda. He had ideas like that all the time. But this idea, though, would be the last one that I heard while we lived together. My parents divorced, and we coped with the stress differently. I found therapy, and B left the family, only to kind of pop in on the holidays. And I'll never forget the day I got admitted to grad school, because on that same day, my sister called me and said B was arrested. I wasn't surprised. Given the neighborhood we grew up in, Magnon probably would have said the same thing about me going to college. It's impossible. Any first-generation college student will tell you the constant setbacks of not knowing anything make college feel impossible. But I did it because I wanted to help my family. Anyway, my sister said B was arrested for selling drugs. So he calls us from LA County and said he was having a baby and she was due any day, and he was just trying to make a little bit of extra money to get her some diapers. So he did what he had to do to help his family. One phrase, two completely different definitions. And I hated him for how he defined his. He sold drugs. But I couldn't just sit there and pretend like I didn't hear him say he did it, because he needed to help his family. So that was hard, because I eventually spoke to him and said, I don't agree with what you did, but I know why you did it, and I understand. And that understanding brought him back into our family and helped him get his life back on track, not only for himself, but for his daughter. He's got a bit of work to do, but I know he'll do it because he's smart. He also thought up Google Drive. Well, kinda. Anyway, that's the story of my family's B. But there are many others who, like him, face their place in the world and nothing less, because of the incomplete stories we tell about them. But now that we know how to listen better, I'll ask you, the next time you see a bee, ask it how its wings work. Because the answer might just change the world.